Thank you, Minister, for that very concise.
I'm not sure it was that concise. I think
for me, at least,
spoke for more than half an hour.
Well, it's a big topic, and you are trying to integrate the topic with other issues that have come up. So it is, for me, a clear explanation of what the government, or in this case, you yourself as a minister, see the situation. We should go straight into looking at the comments and questions from the audience out there. But maybe taking advantage of my moderator's privilege, I want to start by asking you a particular question. As we see now the reaction of Singaporeans, we are getting more and more reactions from younger Singaporeans who feel that their concerns about political and social issues should be just as important as the earlier concerns about making a living and all that. Is this a generational thing, or there is something more than the separation of the younger and older Singaporeans? How can government, or how can the leadership in government tackle this going forward?
Well, Keng Yong, I think it's a shift over time. In many ways, it is to be expected, because as society evolves and matures, there will be new dimensions of inequality that emerge, and a stronger desire for fairness to be applied across these new dimensions. Take the example of public housing. We used to just provide flats for married couples. Over time, increasingly, you now have calls for flats also for singles, for divorcees, for single unwed parents. It's not, so this is not just social political, it's also, partly bread and butter, but there is a call for fairness in these new dimensions, and public policy has had to adjust, and we've started changing some of our policies on HDB flats over time. But I should also add and highlight that from the government's point of view, our conception and our vision of a fair and just society has never been narrowly applied to just bread and butter issues. We have always been very mindful of fairness across social and political dimensions. And that's why from the very beginning, the PAP government put in the Women's Charter in order to protect and advance the rights of women. And we enshrine racial and religious equality in our constitution. So as society evolves, as new demands and new desires reflected in society, the government has to respond, and policies will accordingly evolve. I think the way forward for all of us in this new phase of development is, as I said just now in my speech, for us to engage deeply, listen to one another. It's not just about every group pushing for maximum rights and entitlements for themselves, because it will not be possible to accommodate all of these requests. There will be trade-offs that have to be made. There will be difficult prioritization decisions that have to be made. So how can we continue this engagement in a spirit of mutual benefit, in a spirit of continuously expanding the common ground we share? And if we do that, I think we can move forward together as a society.
Recently, I had a conversation with a foreign friend of mine, and he had been here for the last almost a year because of the COVID-19 restriction for travel. And he was somewhat intrigued by the constant appearance on TV or on social media by the Prime Minister, by the Minister, to explain the policies, measures taken.
On COVID?
On COVID, yeah. And then he started to look at the kind of political, social, economic issues that Singaporeans encounter. And he noticed two things. One, people, the Singaporeans, always look forward to some form of explanation from the leadership on particular challenges of the day. Secondly, he's trying to figure out, is there a singular Singaporean identity from all this socialization, all this development of the past 50 over years? Yeah. And if so, how is this singular identity of Singaporean being stacked up with the rest of the new ideas you get on social media from the younger generation who feel they have every right to add on to this designed, conceptualized or practice identity that Singaporeans are exposed to from constant speeches and exhortation from the government leaders. How you feel about this?
The Singaporean identity has never been a singular one. As I mentioned just now, we have multiple identities, and we don't have to give up these multiple identities. We can be of different race, whatever your identity is in the real world or in the metaverse. You don't have to give them up. You can be Singaporean and all of that at the same time. I think what's important is to find the commonality and the common ground we all share as Singaporeans. And so that's critical because that's the building block in any country, in any society. In the end, it's about how we interact and relate to one another as Singaporeans and the trust we have in one another. And it sounds like very straightforward thing, but these things can move and shift very quickly. Look at America. We all have been reading stories about, or reading analysis about what's happening in America. 2 generations ago, about 60% of Americans would say they have a high level of trust in their fellow Americans. Or if you ask them, is your neighbor trustworthy? Again, about 60% of Americans would say yes. Today, that figure is about 1/3. It's come down so sharply. And if you poll the younger folks, the younger generations, the figure is lower. The distrust is lower. And the point is, when people lose faith with each other, it is very hard to hold a country together. And so what we must ensure is that even with these multiple identities that may take root in Singapore, we should never demonize one another. We should never lose trust in each other. We should always keep faith with our fellow Singaporeans despite our differences. And from the government's point of view, as I mentioned just now, we will strive to be a fair and honest broker in these conversations. We will listen to different sides of the debate. We will attempt to understand how attitudes and mindsets are shifting, because they will shift over time. It's not a static position. And as we do that, where there are policy decisions to be made, we will strive to find the appropriate policy setting. In some instances, we may decide after lengthy deliberation and discussion to make adjustments to our policies, like we did with the wearing of tudung for nurses. In other instances, we may decide that we keep the policy, but we allow more flexibilities at the margins, like what we have done with our ethnic integration policy for HDB flats. So I think this process of allowing conversations to happen, engaging deeply with humility and respect for one another, and then understanding that whatever the policy may be today, it is never static, because policies will ultimately reflect the evolving balance in our society. And we are all committed to this process, to ensuring that our policies reflect that balance in society, which will continue to shift and change.
So, in Rajaratnam School of International Study at NTU, we have a lot of foreign scholars and researchers, and also increasingly more foreign students. And they are always intrigued by one thing that they try to get a fix on, which is that if they are in the NTU campus, they talk among themselves, they can understand what you have just said. But when they go out to the surrounding HDB residential area or the food centers or the what we call hawker centers in Singapore, they just wonder how Singaporean of all background, all levels of social achievement integrate and understand what you just said. So I encourage some of them to maybe go to the community center, to the Meet the People session of the elected members of parliament to understand how this thing is being communicated. Because they appreciate all this that we have been listening to you in the past half hour or so. But they just wonder how the mechanic of it is being executed. Yeah? And what happened is there is a guy who just refused to listen to your idea of wearing masks, and he go out there in the middle of the public square at the food center to say, we don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. Yeah. So this is something that intrigues a lot of what I call non-Singaporean, and even maybe the younger Singaporean who are trying to understand this.
Yes, I would say it applies to some segments of our own people too, that we do need to, we sometimes live in our own worlds, and there's a lot of echo chamber effect, thinking that this perspective that I share with my tribe, in fact, is shared across the board with all Singaporeans, but it's not always the case. And that's why, I mean, this is not new. The people talk about contact theory, right? The more you have contact with one another, the more you are able to address blind spots, prejudices, stereotypes, because you start to realize people are different, but the difference is not something to be afraid of. In fact, we also have many things in common. And we see things from another perspectives. We learn to have empathy with one another. That's a whole point of building social capital. That's a whole point of having networks and human relationships, which is why these have to be strengthened. It's unfortunate with the pandemic that we have had less of fewer opportunities to do so over the last 2 years. Zoom is not the same. Virtual meetings are not the same because you don't get the chance to interact, you don't get the chance to sort of feel the person and get the sense of the expression, body language and all. So it's not quite the same, and that's why also we hope that as we begin to ease on our restrictions and open up gradually, we will be able to resume many of these activities, many of these social interactions, be it in our schools, our institutions of higher learning, or in our community.
So there is a very interesting question posed by one of our listeners, and many others have supported this particular question. In the process that you mentioned, there is always the necessity for people to tell someone in charge, some guys or some groups are not doing what is expected of them socially, or there is a failing or shortfall in human relationship. In America, they call it whistleblower. Yeah. And in recent days, there are quite a few such whistleblowers. And the reaction on social media or even in other media has been quite negative in some sense. So how do we sort of, the question posed to you is, how do we deal with this side of situation? Do we protect the whistleblower more extensively, more intensively? And how does that work with their relationship with other members of their community? Going forward, this is an issue that at least this questioner and those who follow his question want to know from you.
There is a role for whistleblowing in any society. There is a role for someone to call out, identify and call out wrongdoing of any sort. It can happen in our HDB flats. It can happen now with COVID-19 and all the restrictions and measures for COVID-19, or it can happen in a company setting. I think the issue is how this is done, and the processes for it to sort of address the wrong without harming the broader relationships that are at stake. And that's a very delicate process, but it can be done. Certainly, one thing that shouldn't be done is to use the forum of the social media, I think, to galvanize hate and anger against that person and cancel that person out. I don't think that is a very constructive way. Some people choose to do it that way, but I'm not sure that in the longer term that strengthens relationships. But if you have processes, and many companies have processes, many government organizations certainly have processes where when there is a complaint, we take every complaint seriously. We seek to protect the identity of the person who is a whistleblower unless he or she is prepared to be identified. Because from time to time, some of these things may need mediation, you may need to follow up. So if the person is prepared to be identified, fine. But there are processes to protect the identity of the whistleblower while at the same time making sure that the issues are put right and rectified. And that's what we have been trying to do all this while.
I think underlying this particular line of questions are also concerns by some of these citizens, Singaporeans, about the legislation that have been introduced to deal with, what is seen to be whistleblowing attempts, but actually speaking out on certain forms of racism and discrimination. Yeah. So this is something that the leadership will have to.
But there's nothing in legislation that prevents legitimate whistleblowing.
Yeah. That's the good part about whistleblowing process. Yeah. The other interesting point raised by some of the audience, some members of the audience, is this idea of, you talk about tribalism and all the concerns of these individual groups or separate groups of promoters of their respective viewpoint. The interpretation by some of the listener to your speech is that they are also securing their own rights. It's not just advocating the supremacy of what they are characteristic or belonging to a particular tribes. So how do you sort of balance this? Tribalism is not just reaching out to attack other people and their identity, but it's also to secure what is perceived to be their own rights and their own sense of security.
Absolutely. And if I had addressed that, and I had was quite careful to highlight the point that there are differences in lived realities amongst different tribes or different groups, and it is entirely legitimate for any tribe or group to seek to organize themselves, to want to promote their well-being and interests. In fact, we welcome that. That's part of how our society evolves and becoming more open and diverse. What I'm cautioning about is more an attitude and mindset, that if one takes an aggressive, confrontational approach, asserting maximum entitlement and rights against other groups, and this dynamic can easily happen in our society because it has happened in almost all other societies we've looked at. If that sort of attitude and dynamic sets in, takes root in Singapore, it will very quickly erode trust in one another, and that's my bigger concern. I talked about the analogy of a trader and how when you trade, you need both sides to come together. You need norms of reciprocity and mutual benefit. If all parties just want to sell, to advocate and sell, and there is no buyer, there is no trade. So in any effective relationship, you can't just have one side. If you're all talking, pushing, no one is listening, I think we are not having a proper conversation. So the call for engagement, I think, can work if we are committed not just to a process of advocacy, but also a process of engagement, listening, compromise, negotiation. and constantly expanding our common space.
Let me move to another dimension from the questions and comments. Yeah, a few of the members of the audience focus on inclusion. And this is particularly relevant because in this COVID situation that we are confronting, we see foreign workers, domestic workers, working in our own respective household and neighborhood are somewhat separated, and many Singaporeans are speaking out against such kind of non-inclusion. So the question that have been posed come across in different form. Some asking, can we do better to integrate the foreign workers among us? How can we, offer better arrangements to integrate them more into our Singaporean society, and how the leadership see such effort with regard to impact on the identity that you talk about?
Sure. Well, when it comes to COVID and public health measures, we have tried very hard not to make differentiation between citizens and non-citizens. For example, vaccines are given out to everyone in Singapore. So, because it doesn't matter, the virus does not respect citizenship.
Nationality.
Or nationality, right? Anyone is at risk. So from a public health point of view, we try very hard not to differentiate. And indeed, that has been our starting point. But we also recognize that certain groups are at greater risk. For example, migrant workers living together in a communal setting in a dormitory. They are at greater risk, just as anyone who might be living in such a communal setting may be of greater risk because it's higher density, more likely for the virus to spread. And that's why some of these additional safeguards are necessary. But the broader point of inclusion is well taken, and I really appreciate people speaking up on that front, because we can and must do a lot more to integrate foreign workers in our midst. We must address NIMBY sentiments when we want to build more dormitories, which we have to in order to de-densify our present dormitories. We get a strong reaction from certain segments because the dormitory is just next to where they are living.
So this is not in my backyard.
That's right.
Phobia.
So I think if we can embrace a more inclusive approach, then we should, we can get more of these things done, and we can better integrate our foreign workers in our society. And it's so vital because we have seen throughout this pandemic that many of them are part of the essential workforce that helps to keep Singapore going through these past 20 months or 20 plus months.
There is an interesting response to your point about trade and reciprocity. So reference was made to the LGBTQ. The point is that what can this group of Singaporeans trade with anybody? Because they don't see they're having the leverage or the rights to trade with anybody. And what would other Singaporean, why would other Singaporeans want to trade and reciprocate any of these issues? And particularly bringing in the religious outlook towards such kind of lifestyle.
Sure. Well, I can understand the sentiments of LGBTQ persons or groups, but I hope they also appreciate it. This is a very an issue where people have very, very strong views. It's so everywhere in the world, but it's so in Singapore too. But I would say to LGBTQ groups that the attitudes are not static; they are shifting, because we talk to different groups all the time, LGBTQ, religious groups, young and old, and you can perceptibly, it's very clear, sentiments and attitudes are shifting, especially amongst young people, but also shifting for the whole of society. So in that sense, the conversations do play a part. It's not futile. It's not as though things will be static forever. You know, as these attitudes and sentiments shift, then society will have to think about where the balance might be, and the government too will have to consider what that balance would be appropriate for society and what policies might have to adjust.
Thank you, Minister. I think we are coming to the conclusion part of our session this morning. But there is a interesting putting together of a few threads here under this general question of why we disperse financial aid or other form of assistance through the community self-help groups. For example, we support Mendaki to help the Malay community, Sinda to help the Indian community. So underlying this particular question, I guess, is an issue about Malay help Malay, Indian help Malay, Indian help Indian, this CMIO, this kind of community supporting its own members. How far will it, can it go, especially in this, in the context of what you just said?
In fact, for the most part, financial assistance from the government is currently now disbursed through the Social Service Office, a centralized government agency, but they have branches all over Singapore, and most of the financial aid from the state is disbursed through the SSO. Does it mean that the self-help groups, the ethnically based self-help groups, have no role? No, it doesn't. What is their role? Well, their role is as follows. We have realized, and I think anyone who is working in this space also knows this, very often when we are reaching out to help lower income households and families, the issue is not simply about giving them money. There is a lot more that is required to counsel the family. Parents, could be a marriage issue. It could be dealing with financial debt. It could be just talking about, certain norms of parenting. And a lot of these is very involved. You really need to walk the journey side by side with the family. You need to understand even cultural issues around that and norms around that. And very often we have found it is easier for someone from the same group to be able to reach out to that family, engage them, and walk that journey with them, particularly that last mile with them. And I think that's a very useful and important role. Financial assistance, government can provide, but that face-to-face, that mentoring, that human touch, that's very hard for any government agency to do. And the role of self-help groups and their volunteers, I think they play a very important role in that endeavor.
Yeah, I used to work at the People's Association, and I do see that need for such kind of what I call customized
Absolutely.
approach. Yeah, but a related question pop up in the sense that many Singaporeans see the lower privileged segment of our population, mainly non-Chinese. So how can the Chinese majority empathize with the lower income segment of our population when there are very few Chinese in that category? And so this idea of having self-help groups to help their own community might not be as efficacious as some of these questioners are viewing it.
Well, I would say that having self-help groups does not mean that we exclude other races and other groups from helping the poor in Singapore. Not at all. It's not an exclusionary approach. It's all of the above. Self-help groups have a role to play, but all of us in the community, and regardless of where our backgrounds, identities, all of us can play a role too to help the lower income in our society. There's so much to do. So we are looking at different ways in which we can better organize ourselves in order to pool together all of these various efforts. It's not easy, but there is a work that's taking place now within MSF, the SSOs, to see how we can better coordinate these multiple efforts, be it from grassroots, self-help groups, a whole range of different community groups, so that we take a more holistic, family-centric approach. It's not about what I want to do or what different groups want to do. All of us have different things we would like to do, but ultimately it's about what the family needs and how we can pool together resources from the whole of society to uplift these families and their children.
Thank you, Minister. I think our time is up, but I just wanted to maybe give you 1 minute. Since you last spoke about race and today you address this issue of identity, what is your 1 or 2 sentences for all of us listening in to you? How do we proceed?
Well, on identity, I would say we should take heart that in Singapore, young though we may be as an independent nation, and given the fact that we have embraced a concept of multiculturalism that involves multiple identities. So despite that, despite our young age as an independent nation, despite our model of multiculturalism, we do see the core of the Singaporean identity growing stronger and stronger. When I became Minister for Culture in MCCY, I read a lot of what Mr. Rajaratnam, our first culture minister, had written. And he talked about a Singaporean identity, even back then, as one that was rooted in many civilizations, and yet something that is distinctive and unique. And indeed now, more than 50 years after independence, we do see something unique and distinctive emerging. It's not just about the way we talk or the food we like to eat and all that. I mean, you can tell apart a Singaporean Chinese from a PRC Chinese, and the same goes for a Singaporean Malay, Singaporean Indian. It's something about our attitudes, our mindsets, and our values. And I think that's something to cherish. And if we can continue to make sure, despite many more different identities beyond race, continue to make sure that that core, that commonality that holds us together as Singaporeans remains the priority, strengthen that, I think that will put us in very good state for the future.
Indeed, I think the element that you mentioned come out more clearly when Singaporeans are overseas and when they are together. Anyway, I think time has come to conclude this session with you, Minister. Thank you for your excellent explanation and points for us to ponder over in the coming days. Yeah, we look forward to another session with you on this topic of identity and Singaporean nationhood.
Thank you
very
Keng
much,
Yong.
Minister.
Thank you.